And we are back. You're chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about how you can get basically a Rolex Paul Newman Daytona or a vintage Rolex Daytona for $4,000 or under. So, let me first say that it's not going to be an actual Rolex Daytona, but something that is par for par, on spec, same movement, basically the same case. All the other specs are there. So if you see these, millions of dollars Daytonas that are selling and are just not quite there yet, we can help you with that one. But first, like, subscribe, all that stuff. I feel like a broken record, but it's part of YouTube, right? Like subscribers, likes, thumbs up, thumbs down, all that stuff. You know what to do. Also, delraywatch.com. Check it out. We've got some pretty cool watches that I know you'll like, and we're just about to post a pretty much brand new Omega Speedmaster. So if you're in the mood for a speedy, you know where to go. We're talking chronographs after all, right? So, Paul Newman Daytona. Rolex Daytona, a vintage Daytona. There's many vintage Rolex Daytonas, but there's a misconception or kind of it's something that a lot of people think because of the numbers that are seen at auction, especially for Paul Newman, who is an actor and a race car driver himself, his own Rolex Daytona. You see the upper millions of dollars, and everyone just thinks, okay, all vintage Daytonas are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. And that's not always the case. So I want to break a quick misconception first before I show you these great Rolex Daytona alternatives, vintage Daytona alternatives for $4,000 or under. Basically, what you have here is you have a picture of a, Paul Newman's Rolex Daytona, and what you see is in the subdials, it has this kind of line and then a rectangle on it. That's called an exotic dial. Now, this is what he is known for. This was a dial that no one wanted. Singer was a brand that produced dials for all kinds of manufacturers of watches and watch brands, and they produce these exotic dials primarily for Rolex, and so you can see these dials on other watches, but this is an exotic dial, and this is what Newman is known for, and so if it doesn't have this type of dial, it could still be very valuable, but it's not going to get you into the millions of dollars likely, because that is what is traditionally considered a Rolex Daytona Paul Newman. And, of course, the movement inside is something called the Valjoux 72 or a Valjoux 722 or a 727 as Rolex had developed that movement. It was not produced by them, though they modified it. Of course, it was a Valjoux movement, and Valjoux produced other movements as well, primarily chronograph movements, and it is a very high-end, intricate chronograph movement. I won't get into it too much, but one thing's for certain is it has a, so the watch is a chronograph, right? And it has this Valjoux 72 or 72 base movement, and that's going to be the watches we talk about. So let's jump into it before you fall asleep. Let's get into the good stuff. The first option, alternative for the Rolex, vintage Rolex Daytona Newman is the Zodiac Rod. Now, this is my absolute favorite, and I think that it looks probably the most like an actual vintage Daytona or Daytona Newman out of the whole list we're going to talk about under $4,000. Now, what this is it's made by Zodiac. Zodiac is around today, though they're not the same company they used to be, but what you can see is the striking and very clear similarities between this and a vintage Daytona. In my opinion, it is pretty close. Now, I've held this one personally in the past, and I've played with them before. They're a little more common than some of the others that we're going to cover in the list. And you can have these things at under $4,000, sometimes $2,000, $2,500. Now, it's becoming increasingly more sought after and more rare because the Valjoux 72, because of the Newman Daytona and the crazy $1 million price tags that you see sometimes, have really driven up the Valjoux 72s. So get them while you can. This is my personal favorite. And of course, the quality is on par with Rolex of the day. We're talking vintage watches. By the way, the Valjoux 72 is produced until about 1974, so you have a very narrow window that you need to strike on. Next, a LIQU Valjoux 72. Now, basically what you have is, you have a JLC or what was JLC. It wasn't Jaeger LaCultra for the U.S. market. It was just LaCultra for some type of varying reasons. I think I covered it in my previous video. But what we have here is, sure, there's not a tachometer bezel that the Daytona has that is kind of that signature chronograph look, but you have the Valjoux 72, and of course it's coming from a manufacturer like LaCultra that's very high-end and still extremely relevant today, almost Holy Trinity. Currently makes their movements in-house, but this is a Valjoux 72, and so you get that vintage Rolex Daytona feel and presence at sometimes $3,500, depending on if you fish around in varying conditions, precious metal, a little bit more. This one I absolutely love. It looks a little less like the Daytona than some of the others, but nonetheless, it's got that 72, and it's certainly a very high quality vintage watch and increasingly desirable day by day. The next one is also very cool, very charming, and I could easily recommend this to anyone looking for a vintage Daytona alternative under $4,000. A Croton chronograph, sometimes referred to as a Skymaster. They also consider this sometimes to be called the 12-hour marker because it keeps track of the timekeeping as the chronograph in 12-hour increments, which was a big deal, honestly. Tri-register chronographs, double pusher, kind of were solidified as the chronograph optimal layout when the Valjoux 72 really had its heyday during this time with the vintage Daytonas, as well as some of these options here. So what you have here is you have your traditional chronograph, though some of these Croton chronographs have a dive bezel on them instead of your chronograph tachometer bezel. So you have some exchanging functionality. Of course, you're not going to dive with it, and I think it was more like a styling cue at the time. But nonetheless, the bezels still give you that overall look of a black bezel. And it's really charming, in my opinion. It's stylish. You get that 72, and you're not spending millions of dollars. And the 72s are going up in price and value every day. It's a great alternative, in my opinion. Lastly, we have the Entik Sherpa graph. Now, this one is a little bit more expensive. You have to hunt around a little bit. It also does not have that tachometer bezel, but of course, we're not talking about a several $100,000 watch here. We're talking about a $4,000 watch, but like the others, you can see the picture here. You can see the differences. It doesn't have that bezel, but it still has, the tri-register chronograph. It has a very charming look. It's Entik. Entik has exploded in the last few years in vintage. Entik has made some Sherpas and some other more approachable watches as well, but some of their compressor lines and their I don't want to say master compressor, but their super compressor lines are just exploding in price into the upper thousands of dollars, and this is not any different. So if you jump on the bandwagon for a Valjoux 72 and kind of ride the trails of what is going on with vintage Daytonas, this one it's not going to break the bank in terms of high-end vintage, and it's certainly going to give you that kind of vintage Newman-y Daytona look, and it's really charming. And you can also get the exotic dials, like I mentioned earlier in the video of this, because I believe Singer also made those dials for this brand, so they're a little more common than the others. If that is your thing and your taste, certainly give it a shot. Now, there are many other Valjoux 72 watches floating around. There's a Valjoux 72C, which has a calendar complication, and many other variations as well. There's a whole list floating around the internet somewhere that explains them all. We don't need to go into it, but I can assure you that if you're looking for, first of all, a Rolex Daytona Newman for an affordable price, do not buy a replica. Maybe buy there's a Gevrol watch that looks a little bit like it, but it's not vintage. You need to go vintage. You need to choose one of these options. And the beautiful thing is, these movements, because of the parts alone and how expensive the Rolex, really the original Rolexes are, and they use the similar movements, these parts are just going up in value. They're hard to find, and this is something that you will see a realization of a price increase if you hop on and you don't want to get burned. Some of the few exceptions in watches and watch collecting and vintage watches where you will not lose money if you purchase them. So consider these. Let me know what you think below. First of all, are you familiar with the Valjoux 72, these Newman or vintage Daytona alternatives? What do you think about them? Perhaps you just want to spring in and go for the vintage Rolex Daytona. I don't know. Let me know what you think below, but certainly I want to hear about it. And once again, please like and subscribe, all that good stuff. Check out delraywatch.com. Thank you for watching, subscribing, liking, being with me, all that stuff, chatting below, and Instagram, The Real John P. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.